There. You picked the right one. I'd like to just give a nice brief introduction to Joe Walsh. I've known him for a long time now, officially, I think. Yeah, some years. And he was a longtime member of the Twin Cities Chesterton Society, which started in 1996. It started the year before the Chesterton Society started. We started local, and I ran the Twin Cities Chesterton Society for 25 years, and I had to step down when I had to serve as interim headmaster at Chesterton Academy, and I said someone else is going to have to run it, and they immediately went into schism. We became the St. Paul Chesterton Society and the Minneapolis Chesterton Society. The head of the Minneapolis Chesterton Society right back there, Father Spencer Howe. And so, but with division, there's multiplication, because now people can go to 2 meetings a month now. They could go to St. Paul and Minneapolis, so it worked out just great. But Joe's a longtime member. He's actually been a former contributor to Gilbert Magazine. He's written some pieces for us, but he's never given a talk at a Chesterton conference. And he had this great idea that he told me about a couple years ago. I said, this should be a conference talk. And he's actually been working on it for a long time. In fact, he was supposed to originally give it to the conference last year when it was in the Twin Cities, which would have been a lot less hassle for him to get to. But to add to his hassle, his knee went out today, his voice has gone out. He's a candidate for the Cup of Inconvenience Award. Please welcome Joe Walsh. All right.
You've all heard of the sympathy card, right? Okay. Well, I have to start with something funny, because it's going to go downhill from there. Louder? Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay, sorry about that. So I was thinking about, I listened to a great talk by Monsignor Shea, and he gave a talk at a conference. It was quite like this. There was all kinds of talks of joy and humor and wit. And he got up on stage and he says, I always have to give the Good Friday talk. And he says, it's going to be gloom and misery from here on out. So, I better figure out how this thing works. Excellent. Okay. I'll get started here. So, people have been asking me why I chose the title Monsters and Mystics. And of course, the answer is found in Witness, the autobiography of Whittaker Chambers, a man who was a communist for 12 years, and of course is the subject of my talk. And very early in the book, there's a line that really jumped out to me, and it kind of like, wow, that's a pretty bold statement. Man without mysticism is a monster. So I was like, well, I better define my terms, since it's the title. What's a monster? Webster's dictionary says it's an imaginary creature that is big, ugly, and frightening. Chambers' definition would be slightly different. He would say it's a real person whose actions are big, ugly, and frightening. And so who are the monsters in the book? Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, Whittaker Chambers himself, and the people he was working with. So what's a mystic? And here's where Webster's goes off the rails, because it just says it's a cult, it's wizards and warlocks. It's like, no. So Chesterton and Chambers would say it's an ordinary believer who believes there's more to life than our human intellect, our human reason. There are things that happen to us that are outside of our 5 senses. An example, I say a mystic rejoices in what God can do and is grateful. A communist rejoices in what man can do without God and is prideful. I happen to work with a Russian, a former communist, a very smart man who was recruited into the Russian military. He was born in the 60s, and he grew up with Russian propaganda. All the training, all the communist schools. So I said, I got to run this talk by you. And we chatted about it for a while. And he actually gave me, in his true fashion, he gave me the absolute most negative feedback of anyone. And he gave me the most positive. He says, the negative part, Joe, you're going to try to talk about chamber in 40 minutes? Can't be done. Too much to say. The good news that he said, and this actually made me very hopeful, he says, communism cannot work over the long term. It will always fail. And I was very encouraged by that. He's like, it's a failed system. So, now we get to try the button. So backdrop for my story, I'm just going to go through a very quick timeline. So Whittaker Chambers, as we'll see, had a very negative outlook on life. And he viewed life very negatively. And he, so there's the tagline. The world he grew up in, he focused on things that were negative. Now, the first slide is not negative, but it goes downhill from there. So here's my timeline. It starts at the birth of G.K. Chesterton 150 years ago. He's a bright spot. But they were, of course, alive at the same time. So I just wanted to say there's Chesterton, and there's Chambers, born in 1901. So he's just born 27 years later. But again, as a boy growing up, what does he see? He sees all these really bad things happening around him. So Lenin, Communist Revolution, everything's changing in Russia. His buddy Trotsky, Lenin and Trotsky are working side by side to change Russia and hopefully change the world. And of course, the plan was for Trotsky to take over until this guy shows up, Stalin, and he's a real treat. And of course, he pushes Trotsky out and has him assassinated eventually. So he has to eliminate any threat. And this guy's a lot of fun too. So the first 30 years of his life, he's seeing all these horrible things happening, World War I, World War II. And then I want to put in one more slide, just as a little glimmer of hope. Interesting thing happens. In 1917, just at about exactly the same time as the Russian Revolution, Our Lady at Fatima appears to 3 peasant children, and she says, pray for the conversion of Russia, or Russia will spread her errors throughout the world. All right. So this talk is a brief sketch of Whittaker Chambers' tumultuous life. I'm going to interject some Chesterton quotes and thinking to help explain Chambers. It turns out Chesterton, the man we know and love, and Whittaker Chambers, the communist spy, journalist, and Quaker, you might not know, have some things in common. Question, did they ever meet? They were alive at the same time. No, but I did a lot of research on this. They came awfully close. In January 21, Chesterton stepped off a boat from England that had just arrived in New York City. He was to spend the next several months giving talks around the U.S. on a lecture tour. Chambers was a college student at Columbia University, which was just a few miles away from where that boat would have docked. In 1921, Chambers was about as downcast and gloomy as a man can be. And as far as I know, he didn't attend any of those lectures and they never met. Such a shame. So these two men, whose backgrounds are very different, were passionate writers on all topics, but especially politics and religion. They both wrote about monsters and mystics. Chesterton's Father Brown stories are a great place to find the monster and mystic stories, but there's plenty of other examples in his writings. And I have to just throw in a couple wonderful Chesterton quotes. Hopefully, this one has not been used yet this weekend. I think everything else I have has already been used. This is a great one. At the back of our brains, there is a forgotten blaze or burst of astonishment at our existence. The object of the spiritual life is to dig for this submerged sunrise of wonder, so that a man sitting in a chair might suddenly understand he is actually alive and be happy. Mysticism keeps men sane. As long as you have mystery, you have health. When you destroy mystery, you create morbidity. The ordinary man has always been sane because the ordinary man has always been a mystic. He has permitted the twilight. And of course, now moving in a little closer to communism, once you abolish the God, the government becomes the God. I could go on and on. But back to Chambers. Man without mysticism is a monster. And for those who don't understand big words, he immediately repeats it. Man without God is a beast, and more beastly than the beasts. Chambers' story is a conversion story. I could say it's a prodigal son story, except in this case, he didn't squander his inheritance. His father left him nothing but dysfunction and disorder. But it's a lot more than a conversion story. It's about history, politics, religion, journalism, and espionage. At age 24, the young, naive Chambers had no religious convictions, and he wanted to change the world. Communism gave him something to live for and something to die for. But by age 37, Chambers had seen and heard too much evil. He finally started asking some hard questions. Quote, why is it that after 30 years of the greatest revolution in history, the communists have not produced one single inspired work of the mind? What is our lack? Can it be God? How can it be God? His autobiography, Witness, answers those questions. It is a spy thriller, court case, conversion story. It is well written, historic, and inspiring. Something Chambers and Chesterton have in common is I think they both wrote two of the best autobiographies of the 20th century. Chambers spent the years 25 through 37 putting all his energy and time into the communist cause in the US. He was not a mystic, he had no faith, and he failed to understand the heart of communism. What initially seemed like a great crusade later became a terrifying monster. Not until he read the newspapers reporting Stalin's monstrous murders month after month. Quote, not until much later would I recognize Stalin's personal character was not the point at all. The point was not that Stalin is evil, but communism is more evil. The important point was the character of communism, which was the source of Stalin's strength and power. I recognized the facts and reacted to them violently, but I failed to see them for what they were. As usual, in such a failure of intelligence, the penalty was high. For if I had rightly understood, what I saw, I would have ceased to be a communist. And many people, including myself, would have been spared much suffering later on. All right, so let's back up for a minute. J. Vivian Chambers was born in 1901 in Philadelphia. So it's a good thing it got delayed a year, Dale. Right here, not far from this hotel. He was a very sensitive boy, and he had a very sensitive spirit his entire life. He despised his birth name, and he changed it to Whittaker as an adult. But it's important to note he was a U.S. citizen. So many people have said, oh, he was a Russian. No, he was an American citizen. He lived his entire life on the East Coast, in Philadelphia, New York, and Baltimore. His childhood was almost unbearable. He found refuge in a collection of books in the attic and became an avid reader at a very early age. But his father was cruel and unapproachable. His mother and father never spoke. His grandmother was schizophrenic. His brother was depressed and suicidal. His early life was dismal. Dismal. It was so dismal and troubled that he says he wished that house and all its horrors would burn to the ground. He had a keen interest in literature and politics, so enrolled in Columbia University, where he was indoctrinated with modern philosophies, especially Marxism. In a graveyard on New Year's Eve, following his brother's suicide, he sat there with a deep sense of despair and the unfairness of life. And he points to that very moment when he decided to become a communist. And he says, quote, "In the West, all intellectuals become communists because they're seeking the answer to one of two problems: the problem of war and the problem of economic crisis. I felt communism was the answer to the crisis, and I wanted to do something about it. So he and a group of students joined the Open Communist Party in 1925 as official public card-carrying members and looked for ways to pitch in. Chambers thought writing would be a great way to get started. So he became a journalist, and he started writing for a newspaper called The Daily Worker. Just a little interjection. I think Joy Gresham or Joy Davidson actually worked with him for a few months. They were pals in the Marxist newspaper business. Chambers was seldom paid. It was a socialist paper. It rarely cleared expenses. He needed money, so he had to work side jobs, writing and translating. His first big translation project was a German book about a family of deer. You might have heard of it. Bambi. It was a huge success. Disney later made it an even huger success, much to Chambers' dislike, as they drastically changed the story. If I remember right, the original translation was communist propaganda. It was interwoven in the story. Disney, of course, made it American and materialistic. I don't know. Evil hunters. Chambers instantly got offers to work on other translation projects. He turned most of them down due to his long hours and commitment to the Daily Worker. But his skills were getting noticed, and he contributed a lot of articles and short stories to other publications. Within a few years, he changed jobs, this time writing for the New Masses. Different paper, same idea. Not long after that, probably because he was fluent in 5 languages, he was told he'd been selected. He had been selected. He didn't choose this. To join the communist underground. The position carried much more weight and risk. It required Chambers to leave the Open Party and not tell anyone. He was now a secret agent. His life, of course, changed dramatically. This is kind of funny. He had to go out and buy nice clothes and wear nice clothes. He was told to blend in and look like an ordinary businessman. He describes this time like this: all the props of espionage are there. Foreign agents, household traders, stolen documents, microfilm, furtive meetings, secret hideaways, and phony names. His wife Esther wept and begged him not to get involved. But Chambers' handlers muscled him into the communist underground group in D.C. He was given the code name Bob and Carl in D.C. Oh, Bob in New York and Carl in D.C. No spy could ever use their last name, so they could never be positively identified. There was one exception, Alger Hiss, we'll talk about more later, who used his full, real, legal name. He was the best and the brightest in the underground, and above ground, probably, for that matter. Hiss and Chambers were close friends, even though this was highly discouraged. Hiss worked in the State Department. Others had positions in the White House, the Pentagon, the Treasury, and other key offices in D.C. Chambers' role was to meet people and transfer secrets to and from between D.C. and New York. And from there, they'd be moved on to Moscow. His boss was Boris Bykov. It's kind of a fun name to say. An extremely distrustful, shifty Russian military man, but well pleased with the output of information the group produced, especially Alger Hiss, whom he spoke of proudly as the GOAT, the greatest of all time spy. By 35 or 36, Stalin's purge had spread to Europe and the US as well. Several comrades associated with Chambers had been murdered in cold blood. They would be informed with a simple, Fred, Sue, Billy died last night, and they knew better not to ask anything else about it. Chambers was horrified, but always had to act totally committed to the apparatus members around him. He was promoted quickly, and the higher he rose, the more doubts and fears he had. The more he learned about communism, the more certain he was that he had joined something truly evil. So one day, Chambers was lost in his thoughts about work. I mean, what else would you be thinking about? The next spy thing to do, the next microfilm to produce. And he was also watching his 2-year-old daughter playing with her food in her high chair. And he looked at her face, and he looked at her ears, and he had this moment, and he says, "No, those ears were not created by a chance coming together of atoms, the communist view. They could have only been created by immense design. I did not know it, but the finger of God was first laid upon my head." This could only make me think of one thing, Chesterton's great line: "You can look at a thing 999 times and be perfectly safe, but on the 1,000th time, you are in frightful danger of seeing it for the first time." Oh, and I couldn't find a picture of Whittaker Chambers' 2-year-old daughters, so I had to use a substitute. These are my 2 granddaughters. But those are awfully beautiful ears, I'd say. But Chambers was in frightful danger. The thoughts were unwanted. The suggestion that God created his daughter or God existed would be viewed as a weakness, and it would be removed, and it could be fatal. Talking like this was strictly forbidden. Pope Benedict XVI said, "Being Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or lofty idea, but it is an encounter with a person, which gives life a new horizon and decisive direction. The ways of the Lord are not easy, but we were not created for an easy life, but for goodness. That earlier question, could God be what was missing, was continuously gnawing inside of Chambers as he continued the late night secret meetings. But by now, he was groping for God, praying desperately for a way out of the fear, confusion, and perils around him. He says he didn't believe in God, but he needed to pray just to calm his nerves and anxiety. And that incident with his daughter never left him. And then, almost like St. Paul on the road to Damascus, and I say that because there was no preacher, there was no priest, there was no minister, there was no friend evangelizing him. He experienced something extraordinary. And this is a long quote. I apologize, but it's so, to me, it's really good. There was a moment so personal, so singular and final that I've attempted to relate it to only one other human being, a Catholic priest, and have thought to reveal it to my children only at the end of my life. One day as I came down the stairs in the Mount Royal Terrace house and stepped into the dark hall, I found myself stopped, not by a constraint, but by a hush of my whole being. In this organic hush, a voice said with perfect distinctness, "If you will fight for freedom, all will be well with you." The words are nothing. Perhaps there were no words, only an uttered meaning to which my mind supplied the words. There was the sense that, like me, time and the world stood still, an awareness of God as an envelopment, holding me in silent assurance and untroubled peace. On one side of that moment stood 40 years of human waste. On the other side was humility and liberation and the sense that the strength would be given me to do whatever I must do. If I were asked in terms of the modern mind, what was the meaning of that experience, I would answer, I do not know. Something happened in the hall. I experienced something. From that hall, I walked into life as if for the first time. 1 second. I do not mean I was exalted or conspicuously changed. I was still an erring, inadequate man, capable of folly, sin, and fear. But that experience was the strength that carried me out of the Communist Party. It carried me back to the life of men. It never left me. I no longer groped for God. I felt God. That experience was absolute. And after that encounter, I only knew I had promised God my life, even unto death. Chambers says he was like Lazarus coming out of the tomb. He realized he was actually alive, and God's grace was with him. He made a getaway plan, and he used his communist training. They expected deserters to run far and fast, so Chambers' family hid in an apartment just a few miles from his old one. He told his wife, "We are leaving the winning world for the losing world." What he meant was he thought the power and strength of communism would slowly spread and dominate the world. Now, Chambers' statement sounds outlandish and negative, but it's not that different from Our Lady warnings. Russia will spread her errors throughout the world. It just took Chambers a really long time to realize this. Chambers quipped, "I joined the Communist Party to correct the mistakes of history. It turns out I left for the same reason, to correct the mistakes of history, including my own." Chambers knew everyone in the underground network from DC to New York and some abroad. He knew so many agents, he was a high risk for the communists as well. And he had been told repeatedly if he ever deserted, they would silence him in whatever means necessary: poison, murder, exile. Chambers says his story is unique because deserting agents like him would just be murdered. In fear and trembling, Whittaker, his wife Esther, and 2 children went into hiding, dreading the day an assassin would hunt them down. Chambers was not killed, but he ran out of money. A few days later, Chambers was invited to apply for a job at Time magazine. He had to borrow money to get to the interview, but he went and was offered the job. During those years at Time, there was stability, peace, and renewal. He was able to buy a farm just outside of Baltimore, which he deeply cherished the rest of his life. He entered the Episcopal Church and received the sacraments. He walked to Vespers on workdays in New York. As he grew in faith, he turned to silent prayer frequently, and so later decided to settle in a small Quaker assembly near his farm. He says he loved an hour of silent prayer more than anything else. When asked, "What did you find in the Quaker meeting?" he smiled and said, "I found peace." There's a great section, I'm going to skip it, where Chambers says, and it's like a second conversion. I actually love the story, but I'm running on time. So he was a writer at Time. He was forbidden to write on communism. He resented the punishment, and he says he slowly learned to instead of sniping and writing negative things, he said he learned to write positive things. And his readers loved it, and his readership grew. And so I quipped at the end a little paraphrase. The paraphrased version was, just write more like Chesterton. Be positive, witty, and joyful, and readers like it more. A few years after he was there, one of the managers came to Chambers and said, "What section would you like to write if you had your choice?" He immediately shot back, "Religion and politics." With a terrified glance, the manager replied, "I wouldn't dare." He was aware of the conflicts in the office because there were a lot of communist sympathizers. But he got the position. And he started writing about religion and politics, which is just like our guy Chesterton. And he did so for as long as he was at Time. And he says, I felt, skipped. In 1943, he asked and was given the opportunity to do the lead story on Pope Pius XII, Hitler's Pope. But it was a very positive article about the Catholic Church, the papacy, the authority, how the Catholic Church works and operates. It was well received. Catholic schools ordered hundreds, thousands of copies. And there it is. There's his cover story, and it's a nice article. In 1945, the Yalta Conference was held. Stalin, Churchill, and FDR were there to discuss post-war plans. There was a media blackout. Chambers insisted an article should appear during the blackout. He had to fight. They did not want to do this. And he wrote a satire called Ghosts on the Roof. In it, he predicted China would become a communist superpower and a major threat to peace and security in the world. Chambers' critics howled he was crazy about China and insane to poke the bear, Stalin, during the conference. The article was published anyways, and just 4 years after that prediction, China had the Chinese Communist Revolution. And there's a picture of the Yalta Conference. There's our leaders, actually, interesting. Hiss is in the background. And there's our buddy Stalin, pals with Mao Zedong. I'm going to back up a little bit here. Shortly after getting the job at Time magazine, Chambers decided to fight back and warn the public about the communist underground. He contacted Adolf Berle, the Assistant Secretary of State, and told him everything about his former life of espionage. Again, this is in '39. He expected investigations to start immediately. Hey, there's communists prowling around all over the White House, State Department, Treasury. Nothing happened. In 1948, he was subpoenaed to testify. So 9 years, nothing happened. He says, I wanted to warn the American public, I wanted to warn the FBI what was going on, and nothing happened. He said he was fighting for freedom as he felt the Lord had asked. He resigned his position after he was subpoenaed and after a lot of negative feedback came to Time, like, why you got this crazy man on your payroll? He resigned. The mainstream media was heavily slanted in favor of Alger Hiss and against Whittaker Chambers. The case was big, ugly, and frightening. But I'm going to mention just a couple things. Alger Hiss was a smooth politician, an even better liar. He was cool, calm, and confident as he denied anything about communism, nor had he ever met or seen Whittaker Chambers in his life. They had worked together and been good friends for 6 years. Chambers, the ever-sensitive soul, was deeply wounded when the friendship was severed just a few days before Christmas 1937. The case took an unexpected turn, as it was not about spying, it was not about espionage, it was not about giving the Russians secrets. It just turned into a perjury case. One guy says we were communist spies, the other guy says we weren't. And it was basically the headline, one of them is lying. Hiss was eventually confronted with obvious perjury about not even knowing Whittaker Chambers, because there was proof galore that he knew Chambers. He suddenly said he had a vague memory of meeting someone sort of looked like Whittaker Chambers that rented an apartment from him, which was true, but he had denied everything else that they had talked about, done together. The committee went along with Alger Hiss and his version of the story, and they wanted to dismiss the case. There were two exceptions: a freshman Quaker congressman from California named Richard Nixon, and an Irish Catholic judge named Thomas Murphy. Nixon made the case possible. Murphy made it possible for the nation to win the case. Without either man, the case would have been lost. He continues, two faiths were on trial. At its heart, the great case was this critical conflict of faiths. That's why it was a great case. On a scale personal enough to be felt by all, but big enough to be symbolic, it was the two irreconcilable faiths of our time: communism, embodied by Russia, freedom, embodied by the US, came to grips in the persons of two conscious and resolute men. It was my fate to be a witness to each of the two great faiths. He was a witness to being a monster and a mystic. Alger Hiss was well known in DC and throughout the country. It was common to see Hiss pictured with FDR and other Washington elites. But he had no intention of losing this fight. During the trial, they spent 2 years tearing Chambers down in every way imaginable, even to having psychologists testify he should be locked up in a sanitarium. There was tremendous pressure on Whittaker Chambers. During the trial, there were mysterious deaths and disappearances of key witnesses, double crosses, and even microfilm hidden in pumpkins. The American public were intoxicated by the case and waited for every update on TV or radio. Oh, there's his. I'm sorry, I missed the slide. And there's my little pumpkin. They literally found, it's a long story, but there was microfilm hidden in the pumpkin. The media always reported Alger Hiss as brilliant, as an innocent rising star, and Chambers as crazy, vindictive, and evil. At one point, the stress of the trial pushed Chambers too far. He attempted to poison himself while staying overnight at his mother's house. The attempt failed, which Chambers again saw as Providence intervening in his life. His mother, of course, found out and said, "Oh, Whittaker, nobody likes a quitter." They both laughed about it, and Chambers testified later that same day with a wail of a stomachache and a migraine. When the trial finally ended, a heart attack kept Chambers on bed rest for several months. After a partial recovery, he went back to writing and editing for the National Review from 53 to 58. He was happy to be writing again, albeit in a very limited capacity. Chambers has always been portrayed as a modern-day Jeremiah, a prophet of gloom, overly serious and probably crazy. But those who worked with him said he was kind, witty, and charitable. After the trial, the media did what they could to continue reinforcing that he was a vindictive madman. He died of heart failure at 61, and just a few weeks before he died, he mentioned in a letter to Bill Buckley Jr. that he felt the country still did not understand communism and what the trial meant for freedom. President Ronald Reagan posthumously awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1984 with these words, "The witness is gone. His testimony will stand." I couldn't find a picture of it, but I thought, you know what? I love Reagan, and I know his wife went through just as much as he did, although silently. He went through it both silently and publicly. So I thought, that's a beautiful picture of the couple. Okay, we're winding down here. Chesterton said, "The way to truly value a thing is to know it could be lost." And John Adams wrote, "Liberty once lost is lost forever." If I remember correctly, in the Exodus, the enslaved Israelites were first promised the freedom to worship. Chambers knew the communists were brutes. They would close churches, silence the clergy, imprison any nonconformist, guilty or innocent. And worst of all, they would take away the freedom of everyone. Chambers said he would rather suffer and die on the losing side than live under communism. He certainly did suffer, probably much more than he expected. As he told his readers, "If you read this book, it will lead you to Golgotha." At the end of The Man Who Was Thursday, a nightmare, also a spy thriller, Gogol ponders, "I wish I knew why I was hurt so much." And the professor complains to Sunday, "You let me stray a little too near to hell." I think Chambers would have felt the same way. But he was resolute in his thinking about freedom. Freedom is a need of the soul and nothing else. It is in striving toward God that the soul strives continually after a condition of freedom. Religion and freedom are indivisible. Without freedom, the soul dies. Without the soul, there's no justification for freedom. In conclusion, Chambers said his life story was a tragedy, and that by definition, a tragedy, the main character's life is destroyed. If you understand a tragedy correctly, there's still hope and inspiration. As I was thinking about Witness after I finished reading it, I thought about what Chesterton might say. Chester would say, "Yeah, Witness is a tragedy, but it's also a romance." In every romance, there must be the twin elements of loving and fighting. There must be the three characters. The princess, a thing to be loved. The dragon, a thing to be fought. St. George, a thing that both loves and fights. And so in this case, the thing to be loved was freedom. Without freedom, the soul dies. The thing to be fought was communism, right? But Chambers says, against me was an almost solid lineup of the most powerful groups of men in the country, the bitter, hostile reaction of the press, the smiling skepticism of the public, the venomous calumnies of the His forces, the all but universal failure to understand the real meaning of the case, a sense of futility, and all my own weaknesses and inadequacy. The thing to both fight and love was Whittaker Chambers. He fought bravely, spoke truthfully, suffered greatly. Although the victory was not total and not celebrated, it was nevertheless undeniable. Chesterton and Chambers both loved paradox, a story with multiple layers of meaning. Whittaker Chambers was, as he said, weak, flawed, sinful man choosing to fight a monster. But I think his story points to another, much bigger, perfect romance. For God so loved the world that he sent his only Son to fight all the monsters of all time and defeat them for the thing to be loved, the human race. Thank you.
Take advantage of you here because you just have been so enthralled by this talk. We're going to use the opportunity to raise some money for the Chesterton Society. Joe has generously donated two very cool things. His own copy of Witness, because he has backup copies at home. But this is the one with all of his Post-it notes in it. If you've never read Witness, you're going to want to get this book and read it. And so, who'll give me $25 for the book? $25 to read Witness. There's 25 over there. Who wants to pay more than that? 30. How about 40? 50? Okay, 50. Who wants to go more than 50? 50? 50 going once? 50 going twice? 60? 60. 70? 70. Last call? Okay, 100, you won. All right, okay. Great. Here is, as cool as that thing, the original Time magazine from 1943 with the article by Whittaker Chambers on Pope Pius XII. Starting bid's $50. Who wants to give me 50 for this one? 50 back there, and next to you, how do you want to outbid him? 60? 60, okay. 70? Got 80 somewhere? 80? 80 there? 80, 90? 90? 90 there? 100 there? 110? 110, who's got 120? 110, final warning, there's 120 right there, 120. 130. 130. It's a collector's item, plus it's edifying. 130. There's 130 right there. 140. Anyone? 140. Be careful for scratching your nose over there. Okay. 140. Good. Thank you. How about 150 for Chesterton's 150th birthday? There it is, right there. 150. 150 going once. Twice. There's 160. Thank you. 160. 170, anyone? I got 160 over there. 160 going once. 160 twice. Thank you. $160. Great. Marvelous. Thank you so much. We have a short break before the next breakout sessions. Thank you again, Joe. Wonderful talk. God bless you. Thank you.
everyone, as you're translating, or if you're staying here for the next breakout, we will pad with just about 3 or 4 minutes at the beginning of the hour. We'll have everybody start. I just wanted to give you the notice, last call for society merch and books. So in the spirit of raising money for the Chesterton Society, this is your last call to visit our merchandise tables in the lobby as well.